The sound echoed through the high-ceilinged chamber like a stone skipping across glass. Sharp, dismissive, a laugh short, unmistakable, from Justice Brett Kavanaugh, punctuating the silence that had followed Denzel Washington's question about voter access for low-income Americans. The timing was brutal. The courtroom, already thick with tension, seemed to pause mid-breath. Reporters froze mid-note. Law clerks glanced up from their keyboards. Even the C-SPAN cameras, silent and fixed, felt like they blinked. Denzel didn't flinch. He stood at the microphone, hands steady, eyes locked on the bench in front of him. Kavanaugh leaned back slightly, still wearing that half-smile that wasn't quite a smirk, but close enough to sting. His laugh hadn't been loud, but it had been loud enough to carry across marble floors and polished oak, enough to register as contempt without saying a word. He hadn't answered the question. He had laughed at it. The question had been simple, direct, measured. Denzel had asked whether the Supreme Court was willing to consider the lived burden of 2-hour wait times to vote in predominantly Black and Latino districts. Data pulled from real federal reports, community testimony, and cases submitted to the court. And Kavanaugh, in response, had laughed. A beat passed, then another. The room held still. This wasn't a comedy roast. It wasn't a late-night panel. It was a Supreme Court hearing on voter access, a matter that would affect millions. And yet one of the highest judicial officers in the nation had just responded with derision to a question rooted in reality. That laugh wasn't isolated. It was legacy. 2 years earlier, in Bjarnovich v. Democratic National Committee *, Justice Kavanaugh had sided with a majority opinion that upheld Arizona's restrictive voting policies, even as civil rights groups warned it would disproportionately suppress minority voters. His legal rationale: states have leeway, voter fraud prevention, standard procedure, the kind of phrasing that sounds sterile on paper but suffocates in practice. So when Denzel stood at that microphone, not as a lawyer, not as a senator, but as a citizen armed with facts, and asked a question that cut to the marrow of democracy, Kavanaugh didn't just dodge it. He disrespected it. The silence that followed wasn't just professional, it was moral. A clerk in the front row looked down at her notes, then looked away. Justice Sotomayor's eyes narrowed, subtly. Chief Justice Roberts shifted in his seat barely, but enough to register. Justice Jackson tilted her head toward Denzel, lips parted, as if waiting for the next sentence that didn't come. Because for a moment, a full 10 seconds that stretched like slow thunder, Denzel didn't speak. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't shake his head. He simply stood there, framed by history and indignation. That pause said everything. It wasn't just Kavanaugh's laugh that echoed. It was the weight behind it, the decades of legal gymnastics that had turned voter suppression into policy, the smirks behind closed doors when lines at polling stations grew longer in certain zip codes, the eyes that looked past elderly voters with walkers and said quietly that maybe democracy wasn't meant for everyone. And now here was Denzel Washington, not in costume, not reciting lines, but standing in front of 9 justices, one of whom had just decided that his voice, and the voices he carried, weren't worth the dignity of a reply. It wasn't the laugh that cut deepest. It was what it represented. Years of lived experience brushed aside by one chuckle from a man in robes. But what no one in that courtroom realized, not yet, was that the man standing at the microphone wasn't finished. He was just getting started. And what came next wouldn't just silence the room, it would change the conversation. Everywhere, the silence in the courtroom still hung heavy, like dust that refused to settle. But to understand why that single laugh had struck such a nerve, you have to understand who the 2 men were. Not just their titles, but the paths they walked to get there. Because this wasn't just a clash between a citizen and a justice. It was a collision between 2 Americas. Denzel Washington was the son of a Pentecostal preacher from Mount Vernon, New York. His mother, Lenny's, ran a beauty salon, working long hours with her hands while his father worked the pulpit. Church on Sundays wasn't optional, it was life. Scripture, struggle, and survival formed the backdrop of his childhood. He didn't grow up near marble courtrooms or political fundraisers. He grew up near bus stops and corner stores, watching neighbors work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. He saw what dignity looked like under pressure. He learned what it meant to carry yourself with grace even when the system didn't see you. When it came time for college, there was no trust fund or legacy admission. Denzel earned a scholarship to Fordham University, where he studied journalism and theater. He worked cafeteria shifts, cleaned offices, waited tables, sometimes all in the same week, to cover what the scholarship didn't. Later, when he trained as an actor, his teachers said he had the intensity of a trial lawyer. What they didn't know was that Denzel had spent much of his life watching real trials, trials of community, of poverty, of justice denied and deferred. He went on to play iconic roles: Malcolm X, Reuben Carter, Roman J. Israel-esque, characters who fought systems bigger than themselves. But when the camera stopped rolling, Denzel didn't walk away from the fight. He walked deeper into it. He quietly funded scholarships for underprivileged youth. He spoke in juvenile halls and correctional facilities. He visited public schools in forgotten zip codes. He didn't post about it. He showed up. Again and again. That's the man who stood at the microphone. Brett Kavanaugh, by contrast, was born into the cushion of proximity. Georgetown Prep, Yale College, Yale Law. His father was a lobbyist for the cosmetic industry, his mother a judge in Maryland. By the time he finished his education, his path was already lined with handshakes and references that opened doors before he even knocked. He clerked for Justice Kennedy, worked in the White House under President George W. Bush, and carried the pedigree of Washington power like a tailored suit. His opinions were sharp, his demeanor polished, but for many, his worldview had the faint, sterile scent of ivory towers and sealed courtrooms. He had never represented a low-income tenant being evicted, never stood in a church basement explaining voter ID laws to first-time voters, never waited in line at a DMV with people who couldn't afford to miss a shift at work. The people affected most by the policies he helped uphold were people he rarely, if ever, shared space with. In 2018, during his Supreme Court confirmation hearings, America caught a different glimpse of him. Christine Blasey Ford, a psychology professor, came forward with allegations of sexual assault dating back to their teenage years. Kavanaugh denied the claims vehemently, but what gripped the nation wasn't just the accusation. It was the performance that followed. His voice cracked, his face flushed, he shouted, he cried, he accused, and as the hearing spiraled, so did public trust. The FBI's follow-up investigation was limited in scope, time-constrained, and narrowly focused. Critical witnesses were never interviewed. Many viewed it as a process designed more to protect Kavanaugh than to seek the full truth. The man who had spent decades operating inside institutions of power had, in that moment, seemed to shrink from accountability. And now, years later, he sat in a black robe behind a wooden bench, smirking at a question about voter access. A man once shielded from full inquiry now held the gavel over the rights of millions. The contrast was jarring. The imbalance unmistakable. Denzel knew what was at stake. He wasn't there to perform. He wasn't there for applause. He was there because too many voices had been ignored for too long, and he understood something Kavanaugh never had to. What it feels like to be questioned before you even open your mouth. What it means to stand in a room where your lived experience is treated as anecdotal, your data as opinion, your truth as political noise. He had played men like that on screen, but today, in this room, he wasn't acting. He was living the part, and the man across from him, the one who had laughed, he was about to learn what it sounds like when the silence answers back. Perhaps you're more comfortable in the world of cinema than constitutional law. The words landed with the force of a slap, not loud, not angry, just cold and condescending. Brett Kavanaugh said it with the casual rhythm of a man who had grown used to getting the last word. The corners of his mouth curled, just slightly. He leaned back as if he had delivered a clever punchline. On the conservative side of the gallery, a few soft chuckles trickled through the air. Someone coughed to cover a smirk, and then silence again, but not the kind that settles, the kind that coils. Denzel didn't answer. He didn't blink, didn't frown. He just looked down, not in defeat, but with deliberation, and slid a small photo out from the inside pocket of his jacket. No one else saw it, not yet, just him. His thumb rested gently on the edge. It was a picture taken the previous election cycle. His grandmother, 87 years old, in a faded navy coat, leaning on her walker, standing in a line that snaked through a parking lot under a harsh southern sun. The shadows were long. Her spine slightly curved, her lips pressed together not in complaint, but in determination. She had waited there for over 3 hours. She never asked to be a symbol, she just wanted to vote. Denzel looked at the photo for a beat longer. Then he slid it back into his pocket. Across the courtroom, Kavanaugh adjusted his robe, tapped a pen once against the bench, and turned to whisper something to Justice Alito. Whatever it was, Alito didn't respond. His jaw remained clenched. Chief Justice Roberts looked down at his notes. Sotomayor folded her hands. Jackson stared straight ahead because something had shifted. Kavanaugh's line, "The world of cinema," wasn't just a jab. It was a dismissal of every lived experience that Denzel had carried into that courtroom. It was a brush-off disguised as decorum, meant to sound witty but meant to wound. And outside those walls, it did not go unnoticed. Within minutes, the quote began circulating. "Cinema versus constitutional law." Screenshots hit Twitter. Commentators on both sides weighed in, but among communities long told they didn't belong in political spaces, it was something else entirely. It was familiar. The same tone teachers used when they doubted your reading level. The same smirk employers gave when they saw your name on a resume. The same voice that said, "Stay in your lane," without ever needing to say it out loud. Someone reposted the quote with the caption, "This is just shut up and dribble in a black robe." In Georgia, a young community organizer named Malik sat in his car outside a polling station. He'd been volunteering all morning, handing out snacks and water to voters in line. His phone buzzed. A friend had sent him the clip. He watched it, then typed out a short message and sent it to the public email tied to Denzel's nonprofit. It read, "My grandma just gave up after waiting 2 hours to vote. No one talks for us." The message was short, blunt, but it hit like truth always does, unpolished, undeniable. When Denzel read it, he didn't respond right away. He just sat there in the break room outside the courtroom, holding his phone, staring out at nothing. 2 hours in line, gave up. No one talks for us. The words circled in his head like a quiet storm. He thought about the last time he spoke to his grandmother. She had laughed softly and said her knees weren't what they used to be, but she'd crawl if she had to. She had told him that voting was the only promise she still believed in, that after all these years, casting a ballot still felt like an act of defiance and dignity. And now here he was, being told that his voice belonged on movie sets, not in courtrooms, that his insight was entertainment, that his purpose was to perform, not participate. But Denzel had spent his entire life refusing to perform for power. He didn't clap back, he didn't raise his voice. He simply got up, walked to the mirror, and adjusted his tie. Slowly, deliberately. His face remained unreadable, but inside, the fire had already caught. He didn't return to the chamber as a man hurt by insult. He returned as a man prepared for accountability. Kavanaugh had mistaken calm for weakness. He had mistaken silence for absence. But what he had actually done was open a door that he could never close again, because some words stay with you long after they're spoken, and some moments don't just echo, they ignite. When the courtroom reconvened after the recess, the air felt heavier. Word had spread. The earlier exchange, Kavanaugh's smirk, the cinema remark, had already begun to circulate through newsrooms, legal circles, social media threads. Something was building, not outside, but inside. Even those who had entered the room confident in the decorum of the process now leaned forward with a different posture. Anticipation, unease. The sense that what was coming wasn't just testimony, it was reckoning. Denzel Washington walked back in without fanfare. No theatrical pause, no rousing entrance, just quiet precision. His shoulders were squared, his pace was steady. In his left hand, he carried an orange folder, nothing flashy, just worn enough to suggest it had been opened and reopened many times. The kind of folder that didn't hold talking points, it held truth. He approached the microphone. Kavanaugh didn't look up immediately. He whispered something to Justice Thomas, then flicked his eyes toward the orange folder with a look of mild curiosity. A flash of the same half-smile played at his mouth. It was the same smile he wore earlier, the one that said he still thought he had already won. Denzel placed the folder on the podium gently, like a craftsman laying down his tools. Justice Kavanaugh, he began, I'd like to return to the matter of voting access. Kavanaugh leaned forward, his voice smooth. Of course, Mr. Washington, though let's hope we can keep this discussion a little more focused than your previous remarks. A few heads turned. The line was meant to provoke. Denzel didn't respond to the tone. He didn't need to. In your 2018 confirmation hearing, you said, and I quote, voting is a fundamental right in our democracy. Do you still believe that? Kavanaugh nodded, looking bored. Yes, that is basic constitutional law. And would you agree that any restriction that interferes with that right deserves close scrutiny? Generally speaking, yes, he replied, his tone slipping into the familiar cadence of someone reciting policy instead of living it. Then let's examine your opinion in Williams v. Texas, 2023. Denzel opened the folder. In that case, you wrote that a 2-hour wait to vote did not constitute an undue burden. Your exact words were that delays at polling places, while unfortunate, do not amount to a constitutional violation. That case involved numerous variables, Kavanaugh said, already sounding defensive. You're simplifying a complex decision. Am I? Denzel pulled out a laminated chart, 1 page, full color, and held it up. It was a map. Side-by-side districts, labeled and coded. According to data submitted to the court by the Brennan Center for Justice, in predominantly white districts in Texas, the average wait time to vote was 11 minutes. In predominantly black and Latino districts, the average was 2 hours and 12 minutes. He laid the chart flat on the podium. Were you aware of that disparity when you wrote your opinion? The room shifted. Reporters stopped typing. Law clerks leaned in. Even Justice Barrett's eyes narrowed slightly. Correlation is not causation, Kavanaugh said, his voice firmer now. The court cannot base rulings on political narratives. Political narratives. Denzel repeated the phrase slowly, almost like it had a taste. Is that what you call the testimony of an 83-year-old woman who stood in line so long she had to be treated for dehydration? He flipped another page. What about the working mother who left the line to pick up her child, then came back and was told the polls had closed? Or the veteran in a wheelchair who was turned away because the ramp was blocked for hours and no one came to fix it? Kavanaugh exhaled through his nose. He looked down at his notes, then up again. Mr. Washington, with all due respect, I appreciate your anecdotes, but the court operates within a legal framework, not emotional appeals. Denzel didn't flinch. Oh, I understand the framework, Justice Kavanaugh. I'm asking whether you understand the consequences. He tapped the chart once. For you, this is data. For my grandmother, this was 3 days of swollen joints and aching knees. She couldn't walk the next morning without help, but she stood there anyway, because for her, voting wasn't just a right. It was her proof that the country still saw her. He paused, letting the words hang just long enough. And when you say 2 hours is not an undue burden, what you're really saying is, it's not a burden for people like you. Kavanaugh shifted in his seat. His smile was gone now. Mr. Washington. Denzel raised one more page. This is a letter from a poll worker in Georgia. It reads, we only had one machine working. The line wrapped around the block. I watched 3 elderly voters leave. I couldn't stop them. I felt like I had failed them. He folded the letter neatly. And yet your opinion dismissed all of that as minor logistical inconvenience. The silence thickened. Kavanaugh's hands fidgeted with a pen, spinning it once, then twice. The truth is, Denzel continued, your opinion didn't just miss the point, it missed the people. And when the law forgets the people it's meant to serve, it becomes something else entirely. The room was still. The gallery had shifted from note-taking to breath-holding, because this wasn't a speech. It was a dismantling, one layer at a time, calm, controlled, relentless. Kavanaugh tried to interject, but the words didn't come. He adjusted his robe again, but this time it felt like armor losing its fit. Denzel looked up. And for the first time, Kavanaugh looked down. The room didn't move. The walls, the air, even the cameras seemed to still themselves. Denzel stood at the microphone, one hand resting gently on the orange folder. It wasn't theater. It wasn't performance. It was precision, and everyone knew it. He had spent the last 10 minutes unspooling fact after fact, testimony after testimony, building a quiet storm that now hung directly over the bench where Justice Brett Kavanaugh sat, arms folded, lips pressed into a line that looked less like confidence and more like defense. Then came the turn. Denzel raised his head, his voice calm but pointed. "Justice Kavanaugh, since you brought up frameworks and legal standards, may I ask you something slightly more basic?" Kavanaugh blinked. He nodded once, wary now. "You graduated from Yale Law in 1990, correct?" "Yes. And before that, Yale undergrad?" "Correct. And since graduation, your career has been entirely within the federal legal system, clerkships, White House counsel, the D.C. Circuit, and now the Supreme Court." "Yes, that is all public record. Then allow me to ask." Denzel leaned forward slightly. "Have you ever practiced voting rights law at the community level?" Kavanaugh hesitated. His mouth opened, but there was no answer. "Have you ever walked through a neighborhood where less than half the residents are registered to vote, and sat in someone's living room to explain what voter ID laws mean for them?" Still no answer. "Have you ever stood outside a polling station with folding chairs and bottled water because you knew elderly voters would be waiting hours just to be heard?" Denzel waited. Justice Kavanaugh's jaw clenched, the kind of reflex that happens when discomfort has nowhere left to hide. "No," he finally said, "I have not worked in that capacity." Denzel nodded, not in triumph, but in confirmation. "Then let me show you something." He opened the folder again, pulling out a printed spreadsheet. He held it up briefly for the justices, then read aloud. "According to your financial disclosures from 2018 to 2024, you have never resided in a census tract with a median household income below $120,000. You have never lived in a zip code designated as high poverty by the U.S. Census Bureau. You have never claimed charitable legal service, pro bono, on behalf of a disenfranchised voter or advocacy organization." Kavanaugh shifted in his seat. "Mr. Washington, I fail to see what any of this has to do with the legal merits of." "It has everything to do with it," Denzel interrupted, voice still even, "because this isn't just about law. It's about lived experience. You make rulings from the highest bench in the land, but your bench has never been in a church basement or a community center or a folding chair outside a polling place." Denzel paused, then looked directly at him. "So I ask you, sir, with all due respect, what gives you the moral authority to decide whether a 2-hour wait to vote is an undue burden for people whose lives you have never lived?" The question landed like a thunderclap. It didn't shout, it didn't accuse, it simply existed, and that was enough. Kavanaugh leaned back. His face was tight, his mouth twitching as if reaching for a line that wouldn't come. The other justices were silent. Justice Jackson stared at the table. Justice Roberts sat perfectly still. Justice Gorsuch looked away. After a long, stretching pause, Kavanaugh finally spoke. "Mr. Washington, I've been studying constitutional law since before you were out of high school. I think I understand these issues quite well." A few gasps rippled through the gallery, and there it was, the mistake, the mask slipping. The voice of entitlement laid bare. Denzel didn't blink, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, he just nodded once and said quietly, "You may have studied it." He stepped forward, "But I have lived it." The words didn't explode. They settled, and in their settling, they shook something loose in the room. Denzel reached into the folder once more. "Since 2006, I've registered over 5,000 voters, many of them elderly, disabled, or returning citizens. I have personally funded transportation for voters in rural areas who couldn't get to polling places because there was no bus line. I have sat on folding chairs in church basements and answered questions from first-time voters who were afraid of being arrested just for showing up." He stopped and looked up again. "So when I ask you what gives you moral authority, it is not to belittle your education or your years in office. It is to ask what authority any of us have when we rule from a distance over people we've never stood beside. Kavanaugh's fingers fidgeted again with the pen. The smirk was gone, so was the voice of practiced certainty. What remained was something tighter, smaller. Denzel closed the folder. Justice Kavanaugh, you laughed earlier when I asked whether 2 hours was too long to wait to vote. You dismissed real human testimony as political narrative. You suggested my background disqualifies me from understanding the Constitution, so let me leave you with this. He looked up, eyes locked in. The only thing more dangerous than a judge who doesn't understand the Constitution. He stepped back from the mic. Is a judge who doesn't understand the people it's supposed to protect. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was a reckoning, a courtroom holding its breath, a nation beginning to listen. It started before Denzel left the building. The clip, the line, the silence. By the time he reached the back hallway, someone had already uploaded the moment to social media. It was shaky phone footage from the gallery, but it didn't matter. The audio was crisp. The delivery was unmistakable. You could hear the phrase drop into the room like a weight. The only thing more dangerous than a judge who doesn't understand the Constitution is a judge who doesn't understand the people it's supposed to protect. Within 5 minutes, the clip had been reposted by a civil rights attorney in Atlanta. Within 15, it was on every progressive law blog in the country. Within an hour, CNN had broken from scheduled programming with a developing story banner that read simply, Washington versus Kavanaugh. Fox News tried to get ahead of it. They ran a lower third graphic calling it a heated exchange and questioned Denzel's qualifications to comment on constitutional law. But the footage kept playing. Kavanaugh's laugh, Denzel's stillness. The question that followed, it didn't matter how many pundits tried to reframe it. The visual language was universal. A man in power laughed. A citizen stood up. And the room changed. By mid-afternoon, the hashtag had emerged. Denzel demolishes. It trended nationally. It overtook political Twitter, then spread to Instagram, then TikTok. Legal analysts clipped the exchange and slowed it down like it was game tape. Debate coaches broke it apart word by word. Communications professors assigned it as required viewing. At Yale Law School, where Kavanaugh had once walked the halls with ambition in his stride and clerking prospects in his pocket, over 500 students signed an open letter by nightfall. It called for a formal review of Justice Kavanaugh's conduct, citing a pattern of dismissive behavior incompatible with the ethical expectations of the bench. The letter wasn't radical, it was clinical, sober, devastating. The dean of Yale Law declined to comment directly, but a source close to the faculty confirmed they were considering a forum on judicial ethics the following week. One student described it simply, you could feel the building shake. And not from footsteps. Across the country, at universities and community colleges, faculty rewrote next week's lectures. One titled his session, How a Private Citizen Silenced a Supreme Court Justice Without Yelling Once. Another law professor at Howard called it a living case study in moral jurisprudence. The American Bar Association released a statement before the sun had set. Judicial detachment must never mean judicial dismissal. Legal institutions, it seemed, were catching up to the public mood. But it wasn't just scholars, it was people. A woman in Detroit posted a video of her father, a veteran in his 70s, nodding slowly as he watched Denzel speak. He sat in silence for a full minute after the clip ended. Then he said, quietly, "That's how you talk to power." A teacher in Phoenix played the footage for her senior civics class. Several students asked to stay after and watch it again. One of them, a quiet boy who rarely spoke in discussion, raised his hand and said, "I didn't know regular people could say that in court." And that, perhaps, was what made the moment different. It wasn't just the words. It was the weight behind them. The refusal to be small in a space designed to make citizens feel smaller. The precision, the clarity, the way Denzel never raised his voice and yet left the room colder than when he entered. On MSNBC, a constitutional law expert referred to it as the clearest moral calibration of judicial responsibility I've seen from someone outside the court. On CNN, A panel went quiet after replaying the clip. One host finally spoke. "We just watched a Supreme Court justice lose control of the narrative, not through scandal, but through a question he couldn't answer." The response wasn't limited to liberal circles. Even in conservative media, cracks began to form. A columnist for the Wall Street Journal, known for his restrained prose, called The Exchange a cautionary tale for those who believe institutional credibility is immune to human tone. By evening, the phrase had etched itself into headlines. Washington's question rocks SCOTUS, judge or jurist who speaks for the people, the demolition of a smirk in Washington, D.C. Someone projected the quote onto the side of a courthouse. In Los Angeles, a mural began to take shape, Denzel's silhouette standing at a microphone, a line of voters behind him stretching beyond the frame. And in New York, just outside Fordham's Lincoln Center campus, a group of students laid flowers beneath a photo of Denzel's grandmother. They didn't say much, just stood there, quiet, reverent, like they understood what the moment had cost and what it might change. Later that night, Denzel released a brief statement through his nonprofit. "This isn't about me, it's about making sure the voices we ignored don't stay ignored." He declined interviews. He didn't go on late night. He didn't tweet. The words had already done their work. And Kavanaugh, he didn't issue a statement. He didn't appear on the evening news. He didn't leave through the front exit of the court. Because there are some days that change more than a docket. There are some days that change the direction of the conversation, and this had become one of them. The room had already changed. The mood had shifted. The power had tilted. But Denzel Washington wasn't finished. Not yet. He reached once more into that now iconic orange folder, his hands steady, his movements deliberate. He pulled out a single photograph, one print, glossy. Folded once down the middle, creased with time but kept with care. He held it up without a word. The room leaned in. It was his grandmother, 87 years old, wrapped in a simple coat, hair pulled back, a walker at her side. Her figure stooped slightly, but her gaze unshaken. She stood under a blazing sky, surrounded by a winding line of voters that stretched beyond the edges of the frame. You could see the heat rising from the pavement. You could see the wear in her legs, and you could see the resolve in her eyes. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. She wasn't protected. She didn't have Secret Service, Denzel said softly, just a walker and hope. No one spoke. Justice Thomas turned slightly toward Chief Justice Roberts and murmured something no mic caught. Roberts didn't answer. His hand rested on the arm of his chair, fingers unmoving. Justice Jackson stared at the photo. Sotomayor lowered her gaze. Even Kavanaugh had nothing. No defense, no motion, no escape. He sat still, blinking, swallowed once. His pen rested between his fingers, untouched. Denzel placed the photo gently on the table before him. 3 hours, he said. That's how long she stood. 3 hours for a right that others can exercise in minutes. And she did it not because it was easy or fast or comfortable, but because she believed it still mattered, that the vote still meant something, that her voice wasn't too old or too poor or too black to count. He let the silence breathe, not to dominate it, but to dignify it. And if she could stand for 3 hours in line, he said, the least we can do is stand for her in here. There were no objections, no counterpoints, no procedural motions, only gravity, only truth. He closed the folder. He didn't smile, he didn't bow, he didn't raise his hands in victory. He simply said, "Thank you, Chief Justice Roberts. I have no further questions." And then he turned and walked, not with triumph, not with flourish, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had done what he came to do. Behind him, the court remained frozen. Kavanaugh stared ahead. Gorsuch shifted in his seat. Alito glanced down at his papers, but didn't read them. Jackson exhaled slowly, as if holding something she hadn't realized she'd carried. And outside the courtroom, history had already begun. The photo of Denzel's grandmother, now scanned, cropped, and circulating, became something more than a moment. It became a symbol, a T-shirt, a poster. A projected image on walls in Philadelphia and Portland and Selma. The caption beneath it read simply, "What democracy actually costs." Students carried it at rallies. Artists painted it on murals. Organizers handed it out with voter registration forms. It became a face for the forgotten, a reminder that access to the ballot was never truly free, that it came with long lines, tired feet, sunburned shoulders, and the silent pain of waiting for a system to see you. And Denzel, he declined most interviews. He didn't accept honors. When asked what it felt like to dismantle a Supreme Court justice in real time, he shrugged. This wasn't about dismantling anyone, he said. It was about reminding them who they serve. He returned to the communities he'd always shown up for: church basements, school gyms, legal clinics. His nonprofit, now flooded with support, expanded its reach. More buses, more volunteers, more polling site support, not because of the spotlight, but because the work had always been there, waiting. In law schools across the country, professors added the exchange to their curriculum, not just for the legal content, but for the way it was delivered. How one man used silence as a scalpel, how fact became force, how a voice, without shouting, shook marble, and for Kavanaugh, the aftermath lingered. He returned to the bench. He ruled on cases, but something had shifted. His tone, his posture, the way he paused before responding. He had been reminded publicly, powerfully, that robes do not shield you from truth. Because in that courtroom, on that day, a citizen stood taller than the bench, and a grandmother stood taller than them all.